The story of our relationship with Linda began as many student novels begin with a chance acquaintance within the walls of college. It was a time when every day was full of new encounters and experiences, but meeting Linda turned out to be something special from the very beginning. We first met at a party with mutual friends, where chaos reigned, typical for such events. The music was playing at full volume, people were laughing and talking, creating background noise from which you could get lost in the crowd. But Linda was an exception. She sat by the window, a little removed from all this fuss, immersed in her thoughts. Her gaze slid around the room, but it seemed that she was not seeing a noisy celebration, but something much deeper. Her calmness and detachment immediately attracted my attention. I decided to come up and start a conversation, although at that moment I still had no idea how important this step would be for me. Approaching Linda, I felt a little nervous, but her calmness quickly calmed me down. "Are you here alone?" I asked, trying to start with something simple and casual. She looked at me with a slight smile, and in her eyes I saw something more than just polite interest. It felt like she saw right through me, as if she read me like an open book. "Yes," she answered with the same calmness, "I like to watch people. Sometimes it's more interesting than participating in what is happening." This short exchange of words seemed to open the door to a long and deep conversation that we had for the rest of the evening. We discussed everything: music, books, art, philosophy. Linda turned out to be not just an interlocutor, but a person who seemed to live every thought, every question. She knew how to listen with amazing attention, without interrupting, without trying to insert her opinion before you finished. It wasn't just politeness, it was genuine understanding, a desire to really understand what you were trying to say. And when Linda began to speak to herself, her words sounded like a melody, quiet, confident, but with a deep inner strength that you do not immediately notice. Our friendship quickly turned into something more. We started spending more and more time together, as if exploring each other's world. These were not just superficial meetings. With each new meeting, I became more and more immersed in her inner world, and she in mine. One of the things that particularly struck me about Linda was her ability to always be there, even when words seemed impossible to explain what was happening inside. One day, when I was having a particularly hard day, Linda unexpectedly showed up at my house with a cup of my favorite coffee from our cozy cafe. "You look like the whole world has fallen on you," she said, sitting down next to me on the sofa and gently touching my hand. "Do you want to talk?" I sat in silence for a long time, not knowing where to start, but Linda waited patiently. She didn't rush me, didn't ask unnecessary questions. She was just there. And there was something incredibly calming about her silent support that allowed me to relax. Linda knew when to just be there, and that made her an integral part of my world. Linda always amazed me with her clarity of purpose and awareness of what she wanted out of life. When most of our peers were still wandering in search of themselves, Linda firmly knew that her calling was journalism. She didn't just talk about her plans, she lived them. She often spoke about her dreams of writing about current issues, what was happening in the world, and how her words could be a tool for change. I remember one day we were sitting in our favorite cafe, and Linda, thoughtfully watching the rain outside the window, said, "I want to become the voice of those who are not heard. People deserve the truth, and if I can make a small difference in this world, my life will have meaning." She spoke with such confidence that I couldn't help but admire her determination and passion for her work. These moments, when her eyes lit up with the fire of enthusiasm, became especially important to me. They inspired me to strive for something more, to find my own path. We spent sleepless nights together preparing for exams, but our conversations often went far beyond academic topics. We discussed politics, philosophy, the future, everything that seemed important and deep. These were those moments when it seemed like the whole world was open to us, and we had a chance to achieve everything we wanted. After graduating from college, a new chapter of our lives began, completely different from the previous one. We stepped into the reality of the adult world, and it turned out that everything is not as simple as we imagined during our carefree student days. The romance of youth gave way to harsh everyday life. I found a job at a financial services company, and my days quickly became filled with numbers, reports, and a constant hustle and bustle that I had never experienced before. Every morning I left the house before dawn, returned late in the evening, and felt exhausted. Linda, for her part, got a position at the local newspaper. Although it was far from what she had dreamed of, she saw the job as a first, albeit modest, step towards her higher goals. I saw her put her whole heart into it, even when it seemed like her efforts weren't bearing fruit. There were days when she returned home tired and disappointed, but her inner fire never went out, although sometimes its flame barely smoldered. "This is just the beginning," she said confidently when I asked her about her business, seeing her fatigue. "I know this is not the place I dreamed of, but I'm learning. Every day gives me new experiences, and this is the most important thing." Her optimism inspired me. Even when I myself began to lose faith in my path, Linda always remained strong, believing in our common future. We began to build it together, overcoming failures and difficulties that followed us at every step. There were moves, financial difficulties, moments when it seemed that everything was falling out of hand. But Linda always found the strength to support me. One day, after a particularly stressful day at work, I returned home completely drained. All I wanted was to close my eyes and forget about everything. When Linda saw me, her face immediately darkened with understanding. "You look like the whole world has collapsed on you," she said, putting her arm around my shoulders and leaning against me. "Do you want to talk?" I shook my head, trying to hide my feelings, but Linda always knew something was wrong. Her touch was gentle, and in it I felt a promise that no matter how difficult it was, we would get through it. "Everything will be fine," she whispered softly. "We are together, and that's the main thing. We will cope as we always have." And at that moment, I realized that, despite all the difficulties, no matter how many obstacles await us ahead, as long as we are together, everything will be within our reach. However, as often happens in long-term relationships, over time the passion that once connected us began to fade. The fire that used to illuminate our everyday gradually became weaker. We were no longer the same couple who could once spend all night discussing philosophy, making plans and laughing at the smallest everyday situations. Instead, our life has turned into a series of familiar routines: work, dinner, TV, sleep. At first, it seemed temporary. We assured each other that it was just a transition period. But over time, this routine became permanent. I was so immersed in my work and daily worries that I did not notice how an invisible wall was gradually emerging between us. Linda increasingly sat at her laptop, immersed in her articles, and when I returned home, I most often just silently stared at the TV screen or carried my thoughts away to work. We really talked to each other less and less as before our words became routine, empty. One evening, when I returned from work, we were having dinner in silence as usual. As always, I began to talk about my problems with clients, grumbling about new projects that fell on me out of the blue. Linda sat opposite, silently listening. But in her eyes, I did not see the same interest that once shone in them when I spoke. She seemed distant, almost a stranger, even though she was sitting just a few meters away from me. And the saddest thing is that I didn't even notice it then, too carried away by my worries. Suddenly, almost unintelligibly, Linda said quietly, "We need to talk." These three words sounded like a clap of thunder in the night. All my work-related thoughts instantly disappeared and were replaced by a feeling of anxiety. I looked up from the plate and met her gaze. Linda looked at me with a seriousness that I had not seen in her eyes for a long time. Her face remained calm, but her eyes, those deep, expressive eyes that I loved so much, betrayed inner pain and fatigue. It seems that she had been storing up this feeling for a long time, not finding the right moment to express it. "What are you talking about?" I asked, feeling how everything inside was shrinking. It was scary, like a premonition of something inevitable, something that I should have understood long ago, but studiously ignored. Linda sighed, looking down at her hands folded on the table. She was silent for a long time, choosing her words, and I could almost hear the tension hanging in the room. Finally, when she spoke, her voice was soft but full of determination. About us, she said, her voice trembling slightly, but she continued, "We are no longer what we used to be. You feel it, right?" Her words, like a blade, pierced straight into my heart. I wanted to object, but I couldn't. Two strong feelings were fighting inside me, panic and deep pain. I always thought that we had everything under control, that this period was just a temporary difficulty that we would cope with, like all previous ones. But there was something undeniably true in her words. I realized that she was right. Our flame, that fire that once burned so bright, began to fade, and we were both to blame for allowing it to happen. "I don't know when it started," Linda continued, without waiting for my answer. "Perhaps it happened when we were both so caught up in our own affairs that we forgot about what was really important, or when we stopped talking to each other about what really worries us. But I feel like we've lost something important. We moved away." I sat in silence, feeling her words echo in my head. Linda's gaze was full of sadness, but there was no accusation in it. It was the sadness of a person who had long ago realized what I was just beginning to understand. I I began, but fell silent again. Thousands of thoughts were spinning inside me, but none of them seemed right. "You're right," I finally said, sighing heavily, feeling the bitterness of my own words. Linda nodded slowly, as if she already knew I would say this. "I don't want us to just exist next to each other." Her voice became barely audible, but every word penetrated into the very depths of my soul. "I want us to be truly close again, so that we can laugh, dream, and talk about everything again as before. But I'm not sure if this is possible now." The room fell into heavy silence. I looked at Linda, and the image of the girl with whom I once fell in love without looking back again appeared in front of me. But now everything was different. We had changed, and I couldn't help but admit it. "I want this too," I whispered, lowering my eyes. "But I don't know how to get back what we had." Linda nodded again, as if her expectations had been confirmed. "I don't know either," she said quietly, "but we have to at least try. Understand that this is still important to us, because if we don't do this, we will lose everything." Her words sounded like a final call to action, and although I wasn't sure if we could bring back the fire that burned before, I knew one thing: I wasn't ready to lose Linda. I thought about it. Of course I felt it. Deep down, I had long been aware that our relationship had changed, but I was afraid to admit it even to myself. In those moments when we sat next to each other on the sofa, but each was immersed in our own world, when our conversations boiled down to banal discussions of plans for the week or shopping, I felt that we were no longer the same. We were no longer that passionate couple who could talk all night about our dreams, laugh until dawn, and discuss everything from future plans to philosophical questions. We became strangers, as if existing in parallel in the same space, and the most frightening thing was that I did not know how to fix it. I didn't know where to start or what to do. "You're right," I finally exhaled, looking down at my plate as if trying to find answers in it. "But what can we do? How can you return what was?" Linda smiled slightly, but her smile was forced, not the warm, sincere smile that I loved so much about her before. She looked as if she wasn't entirely sure of the answer to that question, but she knew she had to at least try to save what was left. She slowly reached out her hand and gently placed it on mine. Her touch was warm and familiar, but there was a certain uncertainty, perhaps even fear. Fear that we might be on the verge of something bigger losing each other. "I think we need to try something new," she whispered, her voice quiet, as if she was afraid that if she said it louder, everything would fall apart completely. "We've held on to the familiar for too long. Work, home, routine, all of this swallowed us up. We've forgotten what it's like to be brave, to take risks, to try something different. We once lived by this, remember?" I nodded but didn't say anything. Everything she said was true, but I didn't know what could bring us back to that life, to those feelings. "Have you ever thought about?" She paused for a moment, her gaze wandering somewhere to the side, as if she was trying to find the right words, but then she decided and continued. "About our fantasies?" I froze. Her question sounded unexpected and perhaps even frightening. He made me remember the conversations we once had jokingly, discussing things that seemed distant and unreal to us. But now that she said it seriously, I realized that she was talking about something that had long been hidden deep inside both of us. You mean? I tried to continue her thought, but I didn't know how to express it in words. My heart began to beat faster, and I suddenly felt vulnerable, as if I was in front of something new and unfamiliar. I want us to talk honestly about this, Linda said softly but firmly, her voice filled with tenderness, but there was a firmness in it that I had not heard for a long time. About what excites us, what we want to try, about our desires, fantasies, dreams, about sex. We have always been frank with each other, but now it seems that we are afraid to talk about it. I don't want to be silent anymore. I want to be honest with you and with myself. I looked at her, not knowing what to say. It was a conversation I was not prepared for, but at the same time I felt it was necessary. This was the moment that could change everything. Could this be our last attempt to reclaim what we've lost? Or, on the contrary, could it completely destroy everything? Linda looked at me expectantly. There was a slight fear in her eyes, the fear that I might reject her frankness, the fear that she might remain misunderstood. I I started, but again I couldn't find the right words. My thoughts were confused. I tried to understand myself. I wasn't sure. How you felt about this? We talked about this before, but those were just jokes, weren't they? Before, yes, Linda replied, gently squeezing my hand. But now, I think that if we want to regain intimacy, to regain what we have lost, we need to be completely honest. We should not be afraid to talk about what worries us, what attracts us or scares us. I want to know the real you without masks. And I want you to know me the same way. I nodded silently. It was a moment of revelation, a moment when we finally took off our masks and spoke to each other without fear of being ridiculed or misunderstood. We talked for a long time that night, for the first time in a long time. We opened up to each other our deepest thoughts, shared desires and fears that we hid even from ourselves. We discussed what we were missing, what we were afraid of, and what we wanted to get back. It was liberating. I felt how, slowly but surely, the burden that we had been carrying for so many years was being lifted from us. We agreed to move gradually, without rushing and without putting pressure on each other. We decided to respect each other's boundaries, but to be brave and not be afraid to look again for what connected us in the beginning. I felt like this was our last chance to recapture the passion that once lit our path. Several months passed, and life seemed to go on as usual. Work, home, meetings with friends, nothing has changed outwardly. But something inside us has changed. Our conversations that started that night continued. We began to talk more often about what really concerns us. We learned again to be open with each other, to get to know each other again. And one day, I realized that I wanted to do something special for Linda. How do you feel about taking a vacation and going somewhere together? I suddenly suggested, sitting with her at the table in the living room. It was Sunday morning, and we were drinking coffee as we did almost every weekend morning. But this moment was different. I felt that this proposal was an important step. Linda raised an eyebrow, slightly surprised, but her eyes sparkled with interest. She put down her cup of coffee and looked at me with a slight smile. Vacation, she asked. Her voice was a little incredulous. Where do you want to go? We didn't discuss any trips. I smiled, a little nervous, but feeling that this is what we need right now. I was thinking about some place where we could just relax, get away from all this routine, I replied. Maybe on the coast or in the mountains. Just the two of us, no work, no worries. Something new, something we haven't had for a long time. Linda thought for a moment, then her face softened and she nodded. That sounds like a good idea, she said quietly, her voice warm and gentle. I think we really need this. Where do you want to go? Linda asked. Her voice was calm, but there was a spark of interest in it that I had not seen for a long time. She clearly did not expect such an offer, and I felt it. I saw her looking at me searchingly, trying to understand what kind of thoughts were spinning in my head. I was thinking about a cruise, I replied, smiling slightly. Watching her reaction, I held my breath. Caribbean Sea. Warmth, sun, complete absence of worries. No work, just the two of us. This is not just a vacation. I want this to be an opportunity to take a break from everything that surrounds us here and try to find each other again. Linda paused for a moment, as if considering my words. Her eyes became softer. The tension that I had often noticed in recent months began to disappear. She nodded slowly, and her gaze, now warmer, met mine. "That sounds like a great idea," she said quietly. There was something new in her voice, a note of hope that I hadn't heard in so long. "I think we both really need this." I felt something change between us at that moment. It was a small, almost imperceptible movement forward, but it became the first step towards something bigger. For the first time in a long time, I felt a slight excitement, anticipation that something important was ahead of us. Preparing for the cruise became a new project for us that we did together, as if returning to those days when every step together seemed like a small adventure. We chose a route, discussed which islands we wanted to visit, what to take with us, laughed, sorting through things that we wouldn't need. This process, although mundane, became something special for us. We started communicating again, as if we were learning to be a couple all over again, remembering what it was like to just rejoice together. The cruise turned out to be exactly what we needed. Bright sun, endless turquoise waters, and a complete lack of stress surrounded us from day one. Every morning we woke up with a feeling of a fresh start, having a slow breakfast on the deck, watching the waves gently rock the ship. It was like a dream time seemed to slow down, giving us the opportunity to breathe, talk, laugh. Days passed in lazy exploration of exotic islands, swimming in the warm sea and evening walks on the beach when the sun went below the horizon, painting the sky in scarlet and golden tones. One evening, as we sat on the deck enjoying the sunset, Linda suddenly spoke, her voice quiet, almost a whisper. "I haven't felt so at ease in a long time," she said, her eyes glued to the horizontal line where the sky met the sea. "Here, on this ship, I can just be myself, without all these responsibilities and problems that weighed on us at home." I looked at her, smiled, and took her hand. At that moment, I realized that our trip had already begun to do its job. We were getting closer. "I feel it too," I replied, squeezing her hand. "It seems that here, away from everything, we can find ourselves again. Remember what is really important to us." Linda looked at me, her face lit up with the same softness and warmth that I once knew so well. And suddenly that spark flashed in her eyes that was at the beginning of our relationship, when the whole world seemed open and full of possibilities for us. "Do you remember our first conversation about fantasies?" she asked unexpectedly. Her voice sounded a little hesitant, but at the same time decisive. I looked at her in surprise, but inside I felt my heart beating faster. This conversation, which we once had on the verge of a joke and a dream, suddenly returned with renewed vigor. I knew that she was talking about something that had been discussed for a long time, but did not dare to put into practice. "Are you saying that you are ready?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. Linda nodded softly, her eyes never leaving mine. "Yes," she answered quietly. Her voice was firm, but at the same time there was a certain vulnerability in it. "I think it's time to stop being afraid. We have lived in this vicious circle for too long, and I want to try something new. Are you ready?" I froze for a moment, thinking about her words. This was the moment when our decision, which we had been talking about for so long, finally became a reality. I felt excitement, but also an amazing calm. Linda was there, and I knew I was ready for this step. "Yes," I answered, looking her straight in the eyes. "I'm ready." The next days of the cruise became something special for us. We began to truly open up to each other, exploring our desires in sex, dreams, and what we had hidden for a long time. Every conversation, every walk, every evening meeting on the deck, all this became a small step forward for us into a new chapter of our life. On the third evening of the cruise, we ran into Robert and Tyrell by chance. It was an unusual encounter that unexpectedly added a new dimension to our journey. We were sitting at the bar on the open deck when they joined our table. Robert was a man about 10 years older than us and immediately gave the impression of a serious and thoughtful person. There was sadness in his eyes, but he tried not to show it. Tyrell, his friend, was the complete opposite, energetic, cheerful, and seemingly always ready for any adventure. We quickly found a common language. Robert told us that he had recently lost his wife and went on a cruise to escape the pain. Tyrell, with his cheerful personality, clearly tried to support his friend, making their journey easy and joyful. Linda and I quickly became close with them, and our evening meetings became something of a tradition. They became for us not just casual acquaintances, but companions on our journey to new discoveries. One evening, sitting on a secluded beach away from the ship, we talked about life, losses, dreams, and what brought us here. The sky was strewn with stars, and the sea quietly rustled, enveloping us in its calm. Linda suddenly turned to me, her face illuminated by the soft light of the moon, and in her eyes I again saw the calmness that I remembered from the very beginning of our relationship. "Do you remember what we discussed?" she asked quietly, her voice filled with confidence. "I think I'm ready to try." This moment was decisive. Linda, Robert, and Tyrell and I began to explore not only new dimensions of our relationship, but also ourselves. When Linda said these words, I felt something turn inside me. All our conversations, all our dreams and doubts suddenly took shape. We were ready. I looked at Linda, feeling excited, but at the same time some strange calm. This moment we have been waiting for so long has arrived. We both knew there was no point in putting it off any longer, no point in holding on to old fears and doubts. It's time to take a step forward. "I'm ready too," I said, looking into her eyes. Everything inside me was trembling with anticipation. We both knew that our decision would change a lot, perhaps forever. Robert and Tyrell, who were sitting with us on the beach, heard our conversation but did not interfere. They understood that this was our personal moment, a moment that did not require outside interference. We had spent a lot of time with them these days, but now, under the stars, on this deserted beach, there was an invisible line between Linda and me that we were about to cross. "When do you want to try?" Linda asked quietly, her voice filled with a mixture of determination and slight nervousness. "Tomorrow," I answered without hesitation. I felt that if we hesitated, we might drown again in our doubts and fears. "Let's start tomorrow." Linda nodded, her gaze softening. She looked calm, but at the same time I saw that a whole ocean of emotions was raging inside her. It was the same with me. The next morning started as usual. Linda and I ate breakfast on the deck, watching the waves as we did every morning. But something was different. There was an electric energy between us, a mixture of anticipation and slight nervousness. We understood that today would be special. We spent the whole day walking around one of the exotic islands where our ship moored. But the thoughts of what awaits us in the evening did not leave either me or Linda. We discussed the details of how this should all happen, what we are ready to do, where our boundaries are. This conversation was not just important, it was necessary. I felt how, with every word, we became closer to each other, how we opened deeper than ever before. As the sun began to set and the sky turned a warm shade of orange and pink, we returned to the ship. Tyrell and Robert were already waiting for us at the deck bar. Robert was still as calm and thoughtful as always, and Tyrell was beaming with his cheerful smile. He winked at us as we sat down at the table, clearly sensing something special in the air. "Well, are you ready?" Tyrell asked, filling glasses with champagne. His voice sounded cheerful, but I knew that behind this outward carefreeness lay a deep understanding of what was happening. I looked at Linda. She took my glass, and a slight smile appeared on her face. "Yes," she answered quietly, looking directly at Tyrell. "We're ready." At that moment, everything inside me became quiet. I knew that we were now on the threshold of something new. Linda and I were ready to not only explore our own desires, but to trust each other in a way we never had before. This was not just an experiment or a step away from the usual. This was a new level of our relationship when we could be absolutely honest and open, without fear of being misunderstood. After dinner, we headed to a secluded area on the ship where we could feel complete peace and privacy. It was a corner of the deck that overlooked the starry sky and the serene sea. Robert and Tyrell led the way, but I felt that Linda and I were leaving behind old fears and doubts. This was our time. When we got there, Tyrell turned on some soft music, creating a relaxed atmosphere. We stood looking at the silent stars and felt how the silence around us became part of us. Tyrell proposed a toast, and everyone raised their glasses. There was mischief in his eyes, but behind it lay respect and understanding that today we were taking an important step. To new discoveries and honesty, he said, clinking glasses with us. Linda and I looked at each other. We didn't need words, everything that needed to be said had already been said. All that remains is to feel, trust, and start this journey together. We have allowed other people into our sex life. It was an experience that changed us. We returned from this cruise not only as a couple who were able to reconnect, but also as people who better understand themselves and each other. This step forward was the beginning of a new chapter where we were not afraid to be vulnerable, not afraid of our desires and openness. When the cruise ended and we returned home, I realized that our journey was not over. It has just begun. Linda and I returned to everyday life, but no longer the same ones who were once drowned in routine. Now we knew how important it was to be honest with each other, how important it was to continue to seek newness and rediscover each other. While this experience was unique, the most important thing we took away from it was a deep sense of trust that changed our relationship forever. We became closer than ever before, and now I knew that Linda and I could overcome any difficulties, opening up a new world of possibilities and desires. Within a few months of returning from the cruise, our lives changed significantly. Linda and I became closer, but not in the usual sense. It was some kind of new intimacy based on trust, openness, and the desire to study not only each other, but also the world around us. Everything we learned about each other and ourselves during this journey became the basis for the next chapter of our lives. This was not just a phase of a relationship, but something more, a joint decision to be honest and ready for any surprises. But one day something happened that took our relationship to an even more amazing level. We, as always, were immersed in everyday worries, but one evening Linda came up to me with that sparkle in her eyes that I loved so much. I already knew that this foreshadowed something unusual. "I have a proposal," she began, a little thoughtfully, but with the same determination with which she always approached all our new steps. "How about another unusual trip?" I smiled, but didn't immediately understand what she was talking about. "Trips, we just got back," I began, but Linda stopped me, her eyes sparkling with something that was clearly beyond the usual. "I'm not talking about a cruise or some kind of vacation. I'm thinking about something more." Her voice became a little quieter, as if she was revealing her innermost thoughts. "How about a trip around the world? But more than just travel, I want to take our dreams and make them come true. We always talked about how we want to live differently, how we want to study the world, people, their stories. So why not go all out with it?" My heart started beating faster. A trip around the world. It was a step I couldn't even imagine taking. Work, obligations, life, it all seemed so immobile, and now Linda offered to literally turn everything upside down. "Are you serious?" I asked, still not believing what she was saying. Linda nodded, her face lighting up with the same confidence that I so valued in her. She was a person who always knew what she wanted from life, and this moment was no exception. "Yes," she answered calmly, "we now have everything to do this. We can work remotely, write, film, share our stories with the world. We can explore, learn, and, most importantly, live life the way we've always dreamed of, not in a box, not in an office, but in the real world." I thought about it. This was not just a proposal to travel, it was a challenge to our entire normal life. But there was something so attractive in her words that I couldn't just refuse. I remembered how we spent that evening on the beach with Robert and Tyrell, how we decided on a new experience that changed us. And now Linda was again offering a step into the unknown, only now this step was even more significant. "Let's do it," I replied, realizing that there was more to this decision than just a thirst for adventure. It was our way of living the life we once only dreamed of. Thus began a new chapter of our journey, not just a romantic adventure, but a real exploration of the world and ourselves. We sold almost everything we had, leaving only the most necessary things, and began to prepare for a trip around the world. Our friends thought we were a little crazy, but most of them admired our courage. We started a blog to share our impressions and meetings with people from all over the world, recorded documentary videos, immersing ourselves in the culture and life of the places where we found ourselves. Each new country opened up not only new horizons for us, but also new facets of ourselves. We explored the depths of the Amazon, walked the ancient streets of Kyoto, smelled the spices in the markets of Marrakech, and danced under the starry desert skies of Namibia. Our conversations became full of passion again, just like when we first met. Now we were no longer just fantasizing about the lives we could live, we were actually living our dreams. And the most amazing thing is that in every new meeting with people, in every conversation with strangers, we found pieces of ourselves. We were no longer afraid to be vulnerable, no longer afraid to ask questions, open new horizons, explore our own fears and desires. This journey was not only a physical movement for us around the world, but also a spiritual and emotional exploration of each other. So, leaving the routine behind, we found the very fire that once died out. And now, in every new dawn, in every new meeting, we lived life as we had always dreamed of. A life full of discoveries, bold decisions, and boundless love. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one. Click to the next one. Click